The Atomic Gambit podcast is produced by the JFK Library Foundation and made possible with the help of a generous grant from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation. Also, in the interest of clarity, we have enhanced the quality of some of the archival audio, including secretly recorded meetings from the White House that you'll hear in this episode. Some of the audio may still be difficult to hear. We have full transcripts of each episode available on our website, jfklibrary.org/Atomic Gambit.
We are one miscalculation, one misunderstanding away from a catastrophe.
Today, the threat of nuclear catastrophe is rising to levels not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. When President John F. Kennedy took office, he warned Americans of the danger ahead of the increasing amounts of nuclear weapons in the world.
Before the dark powers of destruction, unleashed by science, engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction.
This is that story.
The story of the closest moment the world ever came to nuclear war. 60 years ago, Americans discovered nuclear missiles in Cuba, only 90 miles from their shorelines.
This day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict between Soviet vessels and American warships.
And for the first time, really, in American history, Americans understood that, that the American heartland was at risk.
For 13 perilous days, Americans would wonder if they would still be alive the next day.
I was 15 years old during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember the fear and terror we had as high school students about the Cuban Missile Crisis, thinking that the world was basically going to come to an end.
The teachers had to imagine how would they control all of these children if there was a nuclear war.
I was 17 years old at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were all certain that we were going to be not long for living on the planet.
In this upcoming series, you'll hear the voices of President Kennedy and his closest advisors on secretly recorded tapes, as we take you behind the scenes of deliberations in the White House.
Khrushchev announces tomorrow, which I think he will, that if we attack Cuba, that it's going to be nuclear war.
It was a moment in time where our leaders faced the most difficult choice.
I mean, undoubtedly, we could have destroyed the Soviet Union, but would that be worthwhile at the expense of, up to 500,000 Americans losing their lives?
And today, as those risks seem to be coming back again,
Russian escalation in its war in Ukraine, including the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons.
We look at the leadership required to avoid all-out war.
For man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life.
This is Atomic Gambit, the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years later. Episode 1, A Dangerous Road.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear that you will faithfully execute.
On a cold January afternoon, President John F. Kennedy took the oath of office at the United States Capitol. Kennedy became the leader of a country that was growing more fearful of a nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union.
You are the target of those who would trample the liberties of free men. You are in the crosshairs of the bomb sight. An enemy is centering on you.
This is the country President Kennedy is taking leadership of, an America where the construction of fallout shelters and duck and cover drills were part of everyday life. It's a time when Soviet satellites like Sputnik were ominously flying overhead. Frederick Logval, author of the first complete biography of John F. Kennedy, says everyday Americans and national security officials alike worried the next advancement from the Soviet Union would be a missile capable of landing in their backyard, whether it be Boston, New York, or Washington, D.C.
But there's no question that this weighed on people in a way that probably was unprecedented. It reached a kind of peak, maybe even, in, say, the first year of the administration.
Senator John Kennedy of Massachusetts, Democrat, throws his hat in the presidential ring at a Washington...
For Kennedy, He used concerns over the Soviet Union to his advantage as a candidate for president. He alleged there was a missile gap between the United States and Soviet Union that had grown under the Eisenhower-Nixon administration. It would turn out to be false, and that the U.S. had superior numbers. And now, in his first address as president, Kennedy made it clear the United States would ensure that none of its adversaries, including the Soviet Union, would see it as weak.
Let all our neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house.
Logval says Kennedy's inaugural speech was centered around foreign policy for a number of reasons. One, after one of the closest presidential elections in more than a century, Kennedy viewed foreign policy as a uniting issue. 2, Kennedy intended to show his strength as a Cold Warrior because he was following Dwight D. Eisenhower, a 5-star general and World War II's supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe.
I, John F. Kennedy, am going to show in this address that I'm capable of stepping into his shoes and speak to the current moment. That means substantially a focus on foreign affairs.
Kennedy had another target for the speech other than the American audience. In the address, he was also speaking to his counterpart Nikita Khrushchev, premier of the Soviet Union. Logval described the portions of the speech aimed at Khrushchev in 2 parts.
On the one hand, it is, as we all know, an assertion that we will pay any price, we will bear any burden to defend America's national security, America's interest, and that's certainly directed, at least in part, to Nikita Khrushchev, directed at least in part to the Soviets.
Before the dark powers of destruction, unleashed by science, engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction. We dare not tempt them with weakness, for only when our arms are sufficient beyond doubt can we be certain beyond doubt that they will never be employed.
I think what's less often talked about is a second part of the inaugural address, which I think is much more conciliatory. It's really in the latter part of this short inaugural address that John F. Kennedy also talks about the importance of diplomacy, of working to resolve differences. So it's in some ways an interesting and I think highly effective. I mean, it's an extraordinary inaugural address, highly effective but 2-part message.
But neither can 2 great and powerful groups of nations take comfort from our present course, both sides overburdened by the cost of modern weapons, both rightly alarmed by the steady spread of the deadly atom, yet both racing to alter that uncertain balance of terror that stays the hand of mankind's final war. So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate.
Kennedy's presidency would soon be tested in a confrontation that would forever change the rest of his time in office. Before his election, the Eisenhower administration, concerned about the spread of communism in Latin America, already had its eyes on Cuba and was planning a covert operation that would be known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The plan was to train and assist 1,400 Cuban exiles in an attempt to overthrow the anti-American revolutionary Fidel Castro, who took over the government in 1959. Kennedy inherited the plan and had real concerns about bringing the United States into a military conflict in Cuba.
Kennedy had, really going back to World War II, shall we say, reservations about the utility of military force, especially in solving problems that were at root political. And I do think he felt that this was going to be a political struggle in Cuba before all was said and done.
Logval says despite Kennedy's reservations that the situation in Cuba could be solved with military force, he did not want to appear weak by shutting down the operation entirely.
He's a new president. There had been questions during the campaign about whether he was in fact ready for this job. Leaving Castro in place, that close to Florida, as he is more and more pro-Soviet, more and more in line and allied with Moscow, this is going to constitute a problem. And so I think that helps convince him that regime change in Havana is in fact important and something that the United States should seek.
The relationship between Cuba and the United States had been fraught for decades. While Havana was a booming city thanks to the production of sugar, which was an extremely profitable export to the U.S., Castro and other revolutionaries felt U.S. business interests had too much influence and control when it came to the nation's most important crop. In addition, there were severe inequalities of wealth, and issues of racism were common across the country that further separated the haves from the have-nots. Government corruption plagued the country while the U.S. backed its anti-communist leader, Fulgencio Batista. In 1959, Castro and his revolutionaries overthrew Batista, declaring victory in the Cuban Revolution. Sir Max Hastings, who recently published a new book, The Abyss, Nuclear Crisis Cuba, 1962, says Castro's takeover was significant.
He was an amazing propagandist. He had extraordinary force of personality, and he'd achieved something very remarkable by overthrowing the Batista regime.
Like JFK, Castro was young when he took over Cuba. He was only 34 years old. But that's where the similarities ended. Castro would jail or execute political opponents. He seized control of businesses and private assets in the name of the new Communist Republic of Cuba. Before Kennedy took office, President Eisenhower had approved a plan to train and send Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. The mission involved landing 1,400 exiles on the Bay of Pigs in the southern coast of the island. The CIA plans initially called for extensive support from the U.S. military. JFK significantly reduced the amount of involvement by U.S. troops. President Kennedy worried if the invasion looked like it was coming from the United States, it could provoke an all-out military response from the Soviet Union. The operation was scheduled during the Easter break. Kennedy went to Glen Ora in Virginia with his family to be away from the White House and throw off any concerns that a U.S. operation could be happening that weekend. But the plans broke down almost immediately. On the 15th of April, the mission faced immediate issues with bombers missing their targets, leaving the Cuban Air Force intact. The invading force on April 17th was bogged down by bad weather and inaccurate intelligence. As the situation for ground forces grew worse, JFK authorized a group of unmarked fighter jets to assist them. But in a situation where every precise detail mattered, the U.S. forces got even the basics wrong. The pilots didn't arrive in time because they did not take into account time zone differences from their landing point in Central Time and the fact that Cuba was in Eastern Time. 2 U.S. supply ships were destroyed and 4 Americans and bombers were shot down and killed. 100 members of the invading force were also killed and another 1,200 were captured. Cold War expert and Naval War College professor Tom Nichols called the operation one of the largest failures in American history.
The United States failing to dislodge a communist regime right off its shores with a kind of Keystone Cops military operation that nobody seemed to be able to take responsibility for. It was a pretty big blunder, and it definitely sets the stage for much of what happens in the Caribbean after that.
Days after the failed operation, Kennedy briefed the press and said he would not let the failure stop him from using his powers as president to ensure there would not be a communist expansion in the Western Hemisphere.
We will not accept Mr. Castro's attempts to blame this nation for the hatred which his one-time supporters now regard his repression. The American people are not complacent about Iron Curtain tanks and planes less than 90 miles from their shore.
Despite the failure, JFK biographer Frederick Logval says Kennedy himself didn't suffer politically. Logval says part of Kennedy's success in avoiding a political firestorm was how he handled himself after the crisis. In a press conference days after the operation, he accepted the failure of the Bay of Pigs and didn't try to hide from it.
It's an old saying that
Victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. I'm the responsible officer of the government.
Lokval says the political atmosphere in 1962 was very different compared to how the response from Kennedy's opponents would be today.
You know, it's remarkable today, especially in light of our current moment, to think about the fact that Republicans, as I see it, mostly held their fire after the Bay of Pigs. Today, we can imagine that a president who has that kind of catastrophic, development, well, the opposing party would be absolutely crucifying him.
The disastrous failure of the Bay of Pigs did not stop the CIA and the Kennedy administration from looking for other ways to destabilize the Castro regime. In a collaboration with the intelligence agency, the President and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy oversaw a project called Operation Mongoose. In that operation, a working group, including RFK, concocted radical solutions, including assassination schemes, to try to overthrow the Castro regime.
It is at heart an operation that is principally a CIA effort to destabilize the government in Havana with the aim of overthrowing that government, removing Castro's government from power. It also has, we should note, an assassination dimension.
Castro would sometimes get intelligence about these American plans for his demise, and ultimately the threat from America drew him closer to the Soviet Union. Michael Dobbs, author of 1 Minute to Midnight, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro on the Brink of Nuclear War, says fear of another U.S. attack drew the Soviet and Cuban leaders together.
But what Operation Mongoose did do was to convince both Castro and Khrushchev that one way or the other, the Kennedys were out to get Castro.
Lastly, the failure of Bay of Pigs would be a painful lesson about advice coming from the military. Dobbs says it was a fact the president would remember when he met with those same advisors a year later during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I would say that the failure at the Bay of Pigs made him even more skeptical about the advice he was getting from the military and from the CIA. So he began to rely on different people, and he began to rely on his own judgment more. And certainly this was a more experienced president in 1962 than the fledgling leader that had taken over in 1961.
2 months later, JFK would face his next major foreign policy challenge, meeting face-to-face with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Would the president be able to rise to the challenge in confronting the Soviet leader about the expansion of communism and nuclear arsenals? And how would he respond to Khrushchev, who was angry at the president for his provocative actions in Cuba? We'll find out next after a short break.
There is so much we can learn about today by going back and digging into the stories of our presidents. My name's Lillian Cunningham. I'm a reporter and host at The Washington Post. And that idea is what inspired my podcast, Presidential. It's a journey through the lives of every single American president. From President Kennedy to lesser-known early presidents like Millard Fillmore, each reveals a lesson about our country's history. Listen to Presidential and other Washington Post shows wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, I'm Alan Price, director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. As the director of the library, I get to oversee the work of our dedicated archivists, museum staff, and educators as they work every day to share the information they find in the library with the public. Are you listening to our podcast wondering if there's more to the story? Well, you can find out yourself how deep the story goes by exploring our resources here at the John F. Kennedy Library. If you want to learn more about what you've heard today, we have links to the JFK Library's archives, including photos, films, and primary source documents. We also have oral history interviews from some of the key members of the team advising President Kennedy during and after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Visit jfklibrary.org/Atomic Gambit to get started.
In a letter to the president 5 days after the Bay of Pigs disaster, Khrushchev accused Kennedy of meddling in the affairs of a sovereign nation. The premier lambasted the president for trying to force an American-backed regime on the independent nation of Cuba. To this end, he warned the newly elected president, "You are setting out on a very dangerous road."
For Khrushchev, I think there's a growing sense after the Bay of Pigs that Kennedy is weak, that Kennedy maybe doesn't quite know what he's doing. He's young, he's untested, I can exploit this.
Nikita Khrushchev had his own issues on the home front in the Soviet Union. He oversaw what became known as the Thaw, a period of reform for the country which included the de-Stalinization of Russia, where the previous censorship and repression were eased, and some political prisoners were released from the Gulag, an extremely abusive prison labor camp. Nina Khrushcheva, granddaughter of the Soviet premier, says while Khrushchev saw the liberalization effort as important to creating a more bountiful communist system, he viewed too much reform too quickly as dangerous.
Khrushchev wasn't particularly happy with the term at all because he said, well, the thaw is wonderful, but one day it can actually bring the flooding.
Khrushchev also faced hardliners in the Communist Party who opposed any type of relaxation of that system that brought them to power. By the time of the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev's goal of building the communist society he envisioned was not taking shape as quickly as he wanted.
It became clear that the system, the way Khrushchev envisioned it, this kind of the communist environment that he promised to be built by 1980s, that he said the next generation of Soviet people will live in communism, was getting very difficult to achieve. And he was getting frustrated, and he's doing all sorts of changes.
Khrushchev would meet President Kennedy in his first and only face-to-face meeting in Vienna, 2 months after the disastrous operation in Cuba. Historian Sir Max Hastings says Khrushchev saw an opportunity to build strength at home by dominating what he saw as a weakened U.S. president.
There was a lot of unhappiness from the hardliners in the Kremlin, who believed that after the ultimate hard man Stalin, that Khrushchev wasn't remotely tough enough, both in dealing with the West and in dealing with dissent at home. He knew that he had plenty of critics and plenty of enemies, both on the streets of Russia and also in the Kremlin.
Khrushchev, who was 23 years older than Kennedy, went into the meeting ready to dress down the president on his failed attack in Cuba. Khrushchev attacked Kennedy and the United States as the aggressor, saying American interference in the development of independent countries pursuing communist forms of government would lead to war. He said the Soviet Union did not want nuclear war, but would not be intimidated.
And suddenly he's confronted with this Russian who hurls abuse at him and hurls threats at him and tells him he's not frightened of a nuclear war. Khrushchev came out of that first meeting convinced that Kennedy was a completely inexperienced young man whom Khrushchev could bully.
Kennedy himself told New York Times reporter Scotty Reston that the Soviet leader got the best of him. He, quote, just beat the hell out of me. He told another reporter, I've never met a man like this.
And that was a traumatic meeting for Kennedy.
Kennedy had hoped to make progress on a nuclear test ban treaty and an agreement to secure the independence of West Berlin. The city of Berlin had been divided and occupied by the Western Allied forces and the Soviet Union since the end of World War II. The Soviet leader surprised Kennedy by refusing any agreement on a test ban treaty while the Berlin question remained unresolved. In fact, Khrushchev made the audacious call for the United States to sign a peace treaty with Berlin that would remove U.S. forces from the western half of the city. That was a non-starter for Kennedy. In the end, historian Michael Dobbs says the two leaders left Vienna on a dark note that foreshadowed the crisis ahead. Khrushchev told Kennedy, quote, force will be met with force. And Kennedy said if Khrushchev tried to make any attempts to push U.S. troops out of West Berlin, quote, it would be a cold winter.
Kennedy came away from that meeting convinced that there would be a big challenge to his authority, to American authority somewhere in the world. But he was convinced that he had to take a tough line in order not to be pushed around by the leader of the rival superpower.
After he returned, Kennedy addressed reporters from the Oval Office and admitted that the Vienna Conference accomplished little when it came to diplomatic progress on Berlin, the Test Ban Treaty, or any other major goals.
I will tell you now that it was a very sober 2 days. There was no discourtesy, no loss of tempers, no threats or ultimatums by either side. No advantage or concession was either gained or given. No major decision was either planned or taken. No spectacular progress was either achieved or pretended.
But the Vienna Conference did help the two leaders in one key way. As Sergei Khrushchev said in a JFK Library forum in 2013, it was a chance for both leaders to understand each other and further their working relationship as the leaders of the two most powerful nations on Earth.
It was introduction to each other, very important. And through this, they generated some this understanding and some mutual trust, not as the friends, not as people have the same feeling, that the people who understand that we are very different, we defend our national interests, each side, but we can work together to preserve the peace.
By getting the chance to meet and learn about each other in Vienna, the experience would prepare both for the nuclear crisis to come 14 months later.
Our views contrasted sharply, but at least we knew better at the end where we both stood. But both of us were there, I think, because we realized that each nation has the power to inflict enormous damage upon the other, that such a war could and should be avoided, if at all possible.
While the war of words was heating up after Vienna between President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, the propaganda war between the two nations had been going on since the end of World War II. The two nations competed for supremacy in space. Both saw the space race as providing a tactical and political advantage, and in the early 60s, it was a race that the Soviets appeared to be winning, according to historian Alice George, author of Waiting for Armageddon: How Americans Faced the Cuban Missile Crisis.
They were quite successful in terms of using the space race as a way of showing Soviet superiority. The first satellite was launched in 1957, and then like a month after that, they launched one that had a dog in it, and then in 1961, in April, Yuri Gagarin goes up. Even in May, when Alan Shepard went up, the U.S. effort was unimpressive in comparison to the Soviet effort because Gagarin orbited the Earth, and Alan Shepard basically went straight up, and then the gravity brought him straight back down.
But not everything was as it seemed. While the Soviets could boast of these early accomplishments, they often took dangerous shortcuts to get there. For example, on Yuri Gagarin's historic orbital flight, the Soviets had not figured out a way for the cosmonaut to land safely, so he bailed out of the cockpit at 20,000 feet and landed by parachute. Because the Soviet Union controlled the media, few knew what the Soviets were doing behind the scenes to get an edge. Meanwhile, America's successes, and more importantly, its failures, were on public display.
After Sputnik, we had some rockets fail right on the launch pad or just after taking off, and then really spectacular pictures of our failures.
These Soviet successes planted seeds of doubt as to whether a democracy, with all its political obstacles, could compete with a totalitarian regime.
There was always just that thought of, okay, we have looked down on the Soviet Union for years, and now they seem like these big, giant, terribly efficient, terribly capable people who can achieve more than we can.
The propaganda battle didn't end in space. Khrushchev and Castro were very aware of how racism plagued African Americans and other minority groups in the United States. George says they followed the struggle for civil rights by Black Americans carefully.
And then the Soviet Union had the sense to realize, hey, wait a minute, these people are trying to cause change. They're being discouraged by official organizations like the FBI. they are our perfect allies if we can connect with them.
El pueblo norteamericano también discriminado y humillado.
In 1960, during a UN conference in New York City, both Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev made a very public attempt to win over black activists and their support. It started with Castro's decision to snub the typical hotel for UN guests and stay at the Hotel Teresa, a black-owned hotel in Harlem.
Harlem's Hotel Teresa, in a heavy press of security guards holding back throngs of demonstrators.
20th century civil rights historian Brenda Gale Plummer of the University of Wisconsin says Castro's decision made headlines across the mainstream and black press.
It was not a place where distinguished visitors or foreigners would ever be expected to go to. So the appearance of Castro then, in a sense, put Harlem on a sort of an international map that it hadn't been on before.
During his stay, Castro had meetings with Nation of Islam spokesman and later founder of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, Malcolm X, New York NAACP President Joseph Overton, and former baseball player Jackie Robinson. Castro's visit also attracted meetings from other world leaders attending the conference, including the United Arab Republic's Gamal Abdel Nasser, India's Jawaharlal Nehru, and most of all, Nikita Khrushchev. Plummer says while racial justice activists understood that Castro and Khrushchev had their own political motives for visiting Harlem, they couldn't ignore the spotlight the visits put on Harlem and civil rights issues.
It's not about anybody being a dupe. It was about people making use of opportunities to get their points of view across.
Still, not everyone was so quick to get a photo opportunity with public enemies number 1 and 2 of the United States. 500 Baptist ministers protested the visit.
Remember that this is at the point, early 1960s, when the Kennedy administration was becoming, albeit reluctantly perhaps, more engaged in civil rights. And so there was an interest on the part, I think probably of the majority of African Americans at that time to support the administration, seeing it as an ally.
Congressman Adam Clayton Powell represented the district in Harlem where the Hotel Teresa was located. He looked for a middle road during Castro's theatrical visit.
Adam Clayton Powell, he was a very cagey politician. He, in some respects, was playing both sides. He wanted to ingratiate himself with the nationalist and radical elements in the Harlem community, but at the same time, he didn't want to burn bridges with the establishment.
By the end of the summer of 1961, the U.S. continued to look weak with its failures at the Bay of Pigs and in Vienna, a sputtering economy, the successes by the Soviets in space, and a country where African Americans were routinely subjected to violence and discrimination, and by law, denied rights, privileges, and opportunities that were granted to white people.
I can't help but think of Nikita Khrushchev at the United Nations in 1960, taking off his shoe and hammering it down on his desk at the UN, which was a terribly uncouth thing to do, but it sort of carried the message, we are strong, we don't care what you think about the way that we should behave, and this is what we're going to do.
In reality, the U.S. was not nearly as behind in missiles and in the space race as the public perception made it seem. The U.S. had 3,500 nuclear warheads, or more than 6 times the Soviet arsenal by 1962, and with a new push from President Kennedy, the space program was developing more quickly than it had before.
People were frightened by the fact that they seemed to be out ahead, and when you realize how far ahead the United States really was, it borders on being silly.
Coming up, we'll head back to the Soviet Union where Nikita Khrushchev comes up with the idea to sneak nuclear missiles into Cuba, a gamble that would lead to the greatest nuclear crisis the world had ever known.
Hello, my name is Rachel Floor and I'm the Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation.
Are you enjoying Atomic Gambit? This podcast is just one of many initiatives, programs, and resources supported by our foundation. The JFK Library Foundation is a nonprofit that provides financial support, staffing, and creative resources for the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. Learn more about the JFK Library and Foundation at jfklibrary.org. And if you want to join other supporters just like you can donate at jfklibrary.org/donate.
After Kennedy's embarrassing showing at the Vienna Summit, the tensions between the two superpowers, especially over Berlin, were only getting worse. In a radio address in July 1961, President Kennedy doubled down on U.S. commitment to protect West Berlin.
Those who threaten to unleash the forces of war on a dispute over West Berlin should recall the words of the ancient philosopher, "A man who causes fear cannot be free from fear."
In another moment, foreshadowing things to come, President Kennedy laid out the stakes of a conflict with the Soviet Union involving their arsenal of nuclear missiles.
Now, in the thermonuclear age, any misjudgment on either side could rain more devastation in several hours than has been wrought in all the wars of human history.
After the speech, a furious Khrushchev called Kennedy's words, quote, a preliminary declaration of war. He warned Kennedy that any war in Berlin would be no small war, it would be a nuclear one. 6 days after the address, Khrushchev authorized the building of a wall dividing East and West Berlin. The construction began a month later, and it would remain standing dividing Berlin for nearly 30 years. And in one of several moves that would lead to the crisis ahead, Khrushchev began making more overtures to Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Khrushchev used the island nation to put pressure on the young president, who challenged him in his own hemisphere in Berlin. He began sending more aid to Cuba after the Bay of Pigs, including military advisors and equipment.
I think from Khrushchev's perspective, this is fabulous. You've got just off the coast of Florida an ally that you can support, a dynamic leader in Castro, who maybe can encourage further revolutions in Latin America.
For Castro, a strong relationship was even more important after the Bay of Pigs invasion.
And then from Castro's perspective, growing sense, of course, that the Americans are out to get me. Therefore, I need to tie myself more closely with Moscow, with the Kremlin, with very important implications.
In April 1962, 1 year after the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev and Castro became so close that the premier wrote Castro calling him, quote, my comrade, in a congratulatory note about his victory over the Americans. Historian Frederick Logval says there was a lot of mutual admiration between the two leading up to the crisis.
He referred to Castro as the bearded one, and he was enamored with this dashing, charismatic figure. And so I think that on a personal level, he sees himself as a kind of father figure, or at least somebody who's going to be a mentor to Castro.
But that relationship would be challenged in the oncoming crisis ahead. In that same April, Khrushchev was informed by his intelligence about the Americans' development of new Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles. Unlike Soviet missiles, which took hours to prep for launch, Minuteman missiles could be fired in minutes. The missiles were also significantly smaller and could be housed in difficult-to-destroy silos. Khrushchev was now at a huge disadvantage. He had nothing like the Minutemen. In addition, there were older missiles on Khrushchev's doorstep in Turkey, installed during the Eisenhower administration. It was at this moment Khrushchev hatches the biggest gamble of his career, putting nuclear missiles in Cuba.
Khrushchev was a very impulsive person, that's no question. And when he was told by Andrei Gromyko, who was a foreign minister, here is Turkey, and they have their weapons aiming at the Kremlin. So that was his kind of way of creating a sort of certain type of parity.
Nina Khrushcheva says the Soviet premier didn't see sending missiles to Cuba as an escalation. In his mind, sending the missiles ahead of the midterm elections in November was a way to keep up with the Americans' own escalations and force them to the bargaining table.
They would put those weapons, there will be midterm elections, and then they will let the Americans know that the weapons are there, they're not there for being used, but there is deterrence, and let's then now negotiate. That's how he thought it was going to play out.
To make the operation in Cuba happen, Khrushchev still needed approval from members of the Presidium, the governing body of the Soviet Union. But while it was considered the governing body, it wasn't like the Congress of the United States. According to historian Serhiy Plokhy, author of Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was Khrushchev who held most of the leverage over nearly all of the members when making a decision.
Really, people in the Presidium have, with very few exceptions, had no really independent standing, or even felt themselves politically secure to suggest anything that would be rejected.
The operation in Cuba would be the riskiest move yet in the Cold War, with the worst-case scenario being a nuclear conflict with the United States that could destroy both countries. Still, historian Sir Max Hastings says Khrushchev was willing to take the leap because approval of his leadership was near its lowest levels and the liberalization policies were not having as positive effect as Khrushchev hoped.
And what Khrushchev was looking for in 1962 was a coup, partly to regain his authority against his own colleagues, the Presidium, who were beginning to wonder whether he knew what he was doing. And also, he was being challenged by China for the ideological leadership of the communist world. So Khrushchev felt he had a lot to prove. And he came up with this extraordinary idea that the sort of coup that he could pull that would frighten the life out of the United States was secretly to install missiles in Cuba, the Soviet Union's new best friend, and to announce this in a dramatic speech to the United Nations in November.
The plan depended on a lot of good fortune. The Soviets planned to sneak medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles by ship onto the island under the nose of American spy planes. The gargantuan missiles measured up to 100 feet for the largest of the weapons, and the tropical island of Cuba, with a smattering of palm trees, provided little cover for missiles of that size. Despite the obvious, many of the Soviet scouts sent to survey the island refused to tell Khrushchev the truth.
Soviet generals seriously told Khrushchev that they could hide these enormous cylinders under palm trees. Well, the whole idea was crazy, but Khrushchev convinced himself that it was a brilliant idea. And in the summer of 1962, they set about implementing it.
There was one member of the Presidium who voiced his opposition to the plan, Anastas Mikoyan, the second most powerful voice behind Khrushchev.
He was the veteran of the party who started really at the top level of the party and government apparatus at the time of Lenin, served there under Stalin. So he was the only person who was in position, political, powerful enough to raise questions or express publicly disagreement with Khrushchev.
Unlike Khrushchev, he had been to Cuba before and understood the limitations of the island. Additionally, as Minister of Trade, Mikoyan was familiar with America and its politics. Plokhy says the elder statesman didn't believe the United States would tolerate missiles on their doorstep.
He realized that the actions like the ones that were suggested by Khrushchev, putting the missiles, American troops next to the American borders, that they will be a very strong response.
It was the ultimate high-risk, high-reward strategy.
And Khrushchev was always a bluffer. And of course, it's terrifyingly dangerous to bluff when you're doing it with nuclear weapons.
At first, the operation was going according to plan. While the Americans were concerned with the increase in ships to Cuba and assumed they were bringing in some sort of defensive weapons to the island in response to the Bay of Pigs, no one imagined the cargo were actually offensive nuclear missiles. In the meantime, Kennedy's focus was drawn to a number of other issues at home and elsewhere around the world.
There's no question that John F. Kennedy in the middle months of 1962 has a lot on his plate, as presidents always do, and that some of the other crises, including over Berlin, Vietnam continues to be an issue. He's just had a big issue domestically with respect to U.S. steel. So he's been at loggerheads with corporate leaders. Civil rights is, of course, a burgeoning issue. So there's no question that he's got a lot to think about here. Cuba is one of those issues, but only one.
But by September, the frequency of ships from the Soviet Union reaching the island became more of a concern. Frederick Logval says the Americans, even the generals and intelligence officials, still were reluctant to believe Khrushchev would try to put nuclear weapons in Cuba, knowing how closely the island was being monitored.
They knew that the Soviets knew that they had U-2 overflights. So they're thinking to themselves, well, Moscow's not going to do anything like this because they're going to know that, in a short period of time we're going to find out about it.
After a briefing with his generals, JFK notified congressional leaders that they were watching the movement of Soviet ships in Cuba. Pierre Salinger, the president's press secretary, read a statement from Kennedy warning the Soviets of placing any offensive weapons in Cuba or anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. He said any influx of offensive weapons would be, quote, prevented by whatever means may be necessary. At this moment, Khrushchev decided to accelerate his push to get missiles into Cuba. Historian Serhiy Plokhy says his big gamble also got its luckiest break. The U.S. suspended flying any U-2 surveillance missions for diplomatic reasons and technical issues.
A number of U-2 planes get in trouble, either for mechanical reasons or for other reasons, getting over Chinese territory or over the Soviet territory, and that created enormous diplomatic problems and issues for the United States.
In his last letter to Kennedy before the crisis began, the Soviet premier made overtures on both coming to an agreement on missile tests and for a peaceful resolution of Berlin.
I think it's clear, of course, by then that Khrushchev has made his decision. He's going with this bold and many would say reckless plan to install the missiles. He's not wanting to give that away.
Kennedy replied on October 8th and thanked the Soviet leader for opening the door to diplomacy through a test ban treaty. He didn't mention Cuba at all. Meanwhile, CIA Director John McCone had become more concerned about the ships carrying weapons into Cuba, believing them to be more than defensive. When the weather finally cleared up in early October, Khrushchev's luck finally ran out. The U.S. resumed U-2 overflights of Cuba, and on October 16th at 8:45 a.m. Eastern Time, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy arrived, finding the president in bed, and delivered an intelligence briefing that changed the course of history. Bundy told the president, quote, "There is now hard photographic evidence that the Russians have offensive missiles in Cuba." The nuclear showdown JFK expected in Berlin landed on the United States doorstep instead. Khrushchev's Atomic Gambit was exposed, and the Cuban Missile Crisis began.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Atomic Gambit. Along with Matt Porter and myself, Jamie Richardson, Atomic Gambit is made possible with help from our co-producer, Rick King, and supervising producer, Valerie Linson. Thank you to our research assistants, Sarah LaRusi and Megan McKee, and our independent fact-checker, Ben Schaefer. Thank you to the JFK Library's archive staff for assistance with researching and digitizing additional material. We also want to thank the Miller Center at the University of Virginia for providing the recordings of the White House tapes used in this series. A special thank you to Ambassador Caroline Kennedy for permission to use audio from Jacqueline Kennedy's 1964 oral history interview. Our music is composed by Premium Beat, and podcast artwork is provided by Brian Kang. We also thank all of our guests for lending their voices and expertise to this podcast.